Hi students, I'll try in this educational video to technologically introduce the bolted joint resistance as the ultimate limit state criterion associated to bearing, of course, as simply and as clearly as possible. Okay, let's go. Well, as I explained in the previous video, the bolted joints are widely used in various steel connections and they are subjected to various loading. And in the previous video, I talked about the bolted joint resistance verification under the shear force. In this educational video, I will talk about the bolted joint resistance verification under bearing. Well, based on the Eurocode 3 standards associated to the European Standards 1993, the ultimate limit state criterion associated to bearing is expressed as FVED, which is the design shear force, divided by FVRD, which is the bearing resistance, is lower than 1. This simply means that the shear force applied on the bolted joint should not exceed the bearing resistance of the bolted joint. For the design shear force, FVED, it can be simply seen as the maximum shear force applied on the bolted joint, and I explained this in detail in the previous educational video. Now, before explaining the bearing resistance, it's important to introduce the concepts of end bolts, edge bolts, as well as the spacing between bolts. Based on the figure that you see now in this slide, the end bolts are perpendicular to the load direction, the edge bolts are parallel to the load directions, they are called edge bolts in relation with the free edge, and the remaining bolts are the inner bolts. And based on the figure that you see in the right of this slide, this figure depicts the different distances and spacing between bolts. E1 is the end distance, E2 is the edge distance, P1 is the spacing in the load direction, and P2 is the spacing in the perpendicular direction to the load direction. The minimum values of these different distances and spacings are determined based on the table that you see in the bottom of this slide in function of the bolt hole diameter. Now, for the bearing resistance FBRD, technologically speaking, it's the bearing resistance for ordinary bolts. And based on the European Standards 1993-1-8, Table 3.4, the bearing resistance is determined as a coefficient K1 multiplied by another coefficient alpha B multiplied by the ultimate tensile strength of the plate Fu multiplied by the bolt diameter D multiplied by the thickness of the plate T divided by gamma M2, which is equal to 1.25 for bolts and welds. And the coefficients K1 and alpha B are determined based on the table that you see in the right of this slide. Here, FUB denotes the ultimate tensile strength of the bolt. And E1, E2, P1, P2, I explained this in the previous slide. So we can determine the bearing resistance for inner bolts and end bolts. And finally, we can determine the global bearing resistance of the global bolted joint as the number of end bolts multiplied by the bearing resistance of the end bolt plus the number of inner bolts multiplied by the bearing resistance of inner bolts. This educational video takes end. Please, if you have any suggestions, remarks, or questions, please mention it in the comments. Thank you very much for your attention.